As much as I enjoyed the past three videos, I think, and I'm pretty sure you'll agree with this, that this week we should take a look at something that happened a little bit more recently, just to change the pace a little bit. Like, prehistory is fun, but it's time to go back to actual documented history. And I couldn't think of a better way to return to history than to look at the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. Now, so far, we've only been looking at humanity's physical process, right? Stone, bronze, and iron. We've never really looked at humanity's philosophical process. So let's change that. Welcome to Vlogs of Knowledge. The Enlightenment is one very important period. It led and influenced many things like the French Revolution, the separation of church and state, and even the creation of the United States of America. It's a big topic involving many people and many ideas, which we're not going to talk about all of them, but we will talk about the general idea. If you've been watching my show, then you know exactly how I'm going to proceed. Let's put all this in historical context and get some background. Now, the Enlightenment was a movement that happened around the 18th century, but it didn't just happen like that. Some things had to have happened before. A few centuries earlier, the world was in the Middle Ages. Now, if you look at all of humanity's history, the Middle Ages is really what stands out. It was a period of death, disease, war, and absolutely no human progress whatsoever. Even the Bronze Age had it better, and that was what, 3,000 years earlier? And it's not like they had an excuse either, right? The Middle Ages were started around the 5th century BC, and by then, a lot of progress had already happened in the world. For example, ancient Greece, and even the Roman Empire. So how is it that the Middle Ages ended up being literally a waste of a millennium? Well, there's one reason: the church. During that time, the church was everywhere and the church was everything. It had all of the power, whether it be political, personal, or even divine power. There was nothing that you could do without the church's approval. In fact, if you tried, they'd probably kill you. Whatever was happening in the world, any natural phenomena like illness, for example, had to be explained in a way that involves God and faith. Any other reasoning is simply unacceptable and is considered a heresy that could get you killed. The church really wanted to control the population and not let them think for themselves. And that was relatively easy to do. To be honest, people were dumb. I'm not saying that to be insulting, I'm saying that to be factual. They had no education and they had no books. They were just too poor for that. So how can they go against the church, right? The church was their only source of information. Fast forward some 1,000 years later and we have the invention of printing, which all of a sudden gave people access to books. Something that had never been seen before. Combine that with the fact that the church wasn't really the best of rulers, and you can expect that something was going to change. It all started with the process that we call the scientific revolution, in which a few thinkers applied the process of reasonable deduction to matters that were previously God's work. Basically, you observe, you interpret, and then you come to a conclusion, and that has to follow a certain logic. And this was key because it differed greatly from the ideologies of the church. The church never wanted you to think. They wanted you to just accept anything that they said, because that way they could control you. But here with the scientific revolution, all of that was about to change in a dramatic way. People were fed up with the church and they had lost faith in it. After 1,000 years of church rule, all that happened was death. People realized that they could deduct things for themselves and get their knowledge from books, all without the church's help. And that's really all that was needed to launch the Enlightenment. About 200 years after the Middle Ages, well into the Renaissance, a few thinkers around Europe began thinking for themselves and coming to their own conclusions. Now, I'm not going to name any, you can do that research on your own, but I will talk about the general ideas because they'll be important so that you can understand this topic. The main idea of the Enlightenment was that of reason, right? That we as humans could observe anything and deduct our own conclusions. And if we observe something enough and study it enough with rational thinking, we could eventually uncover the secrets of the universe. No longer did we have to listen to any authority for that. We didn't depend on anybody to get our information. We could, and in fact we should, get all of our information from ourselves and from our logic. A sudden confidence had grown in our capabilities. We started to believe in ourselves. And that's another big element of the Enlightenment, belief in humanity's intellectual capabilities. To be able to deduct things on our own, we have to believe that we're able. If we don't believe it, then we'll have made no progress. Belief is really the key here. After 1,000 years of church rule, people wanted to be independent. And does it really surprise you? I think had we lived in the Middle Ages, we probably could have predicted that something like this could have happened. And I guess there were some people who had predicted it, but they were probably killed by the church. The last important belief is the belief in science. It was the belief that science could replace in full and even be better than the church. Science was going to be the way that you improve human life here on earth. And with that movement, the church eventually lost all of its power. It's what we call the separation of the church and state. The Enlightenment thinkers viewed the world as being run by mathematical and scientific laws that could be understood by us through our own intellect. These laws were universal, right? They would affect everything here on earth, but also everything beyond earth. It kind of took humanity a bit long to get there. It was a very impactful period in human history, exactly what was needed after 1,000 years of church domination. Now these ideas were to become the foundation blocks for any sort of rational thinking from then on, and we can still see the effects of the Enlightenment even today. The United States' Declaration of Independence was strongly inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment. In fact, most ideas of free will, free speech, and liberty come straight from that, as there's no way that you would find it in the Middle Ages, and these eventually led to the standards that we have today. It's kind of hard to imagine a world without that, right? Like, it's so out of our reality. It might come as a surprise to you that the Enlightenment actually does have an end, and the end to me is kind of funny because it's ironic. What we have today are the remnants of the Enlightenment, the ideas that were spawned in the Enlightenment, that's what we have. But the actual period that we classify as the Enlightenment, that ended in the 19th century. And here's why. The same great ideas that launched such a movement also ended up, ironically, being the cause of its death. In the late 18th century in France, the French Revolution had started, and the French Revolution was all about abolishing the unfair monarchy. And you can see the influence from the Enlightenment, like people wanted to be independent and they wanted to be free. What was supposed to be a step towards the better actually turned out to be the complete opposite. The French Revolution went through a period called the Reign of Terror, in which there were so many wars that you would literally laugh in disbelief that this was happening at the height of the Enlightenment. But it did happen, and it was horrible. It showed just how unprepared and unqualified humanity was of being independent. It was really the wake-up call that the Enlightenment was not going to be the end-all be-all. Especially considering the fact that Napoleon, a decade later, came and ended pretty much all of the progress that had been made during the Enlightenment. So that was the Enlightenment. What was once a great century full of progress eventually collapsed because of itself. But it wasn't a total loss. A lot of ideas that were from the Enlightenment we still have today, and like I mentioned, they became standards from what we should expect from a civilized society. So now here are my questions to you. What do you think about the Enlightenment? Have you heard about it before? Were you surprised about its sudden death and the fact that it was killed by itself? Leave me a comment, I would love to know, and bonus points for you, you might get featured in next week's video as a fan of the week. As you know, and as I say at the end of every video, I haven't talked about everything, and the things that I did talk about, I haven't gone into too much detail. That's okay, that's done on purpose, because I actually want you guys to go out and research on your own, and maybe learn a thing or two. With that being said, my name has been Darius Cos, and you can follow me on social media. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next Wednesday.